Well, hello and Merry Christmas to all of you. Hope you had a good one. Few things to say on this one. So, first of all, we had a pretty great pre-Christmas sort of events because we had a couple of masses, one after the other, with some religious instruction from our priest, who's a hardcore battle priest. We had Scully, I hope I'm saying it right. He came all the way from Copenhagen just to meet our priest. Found it very interesting. Realized that the priest is fully dedicated, which is interesting considering he comes from a totally Protestant background. But I wanted to say a couple of things in general about Christmas and Catholicism, because Christmas essentially is Catholicism in action. Now, all of you that are, shouting in the wings, the J. Dyer Gammas, the Protestants who's got a bug up their butt, the reality is that, as I've mentioned many times before, Catholicism essentially Christianized and civilized the West and pretty much the rest of the world. But what I wanted to discuss was an experience that it goes beyond the intellectual concepts of Catholicism, Christianity, and so on, which, it's a sensation you get if you're out and about just before Christmas and people wishing you Merry Christmas and you wishing them Merry Christmas, and just a general sort of sense of things. It's a little bit more prevalent in small towns and villages than it is in large cities like London. But funnily enough, it is quite present even in large cities like London, and in places that you generally wouldn't expect to find it, like maybe quite upmarket sort of shops, like if you've got some Selfridges, for example, you'll find a service people there will generally wish a Merry Christmas, or you'll wish them a Merry Christmas, and there's a generic sort of goodwill sensation more towards people, which you hardly ever have throughout the rest of the year. There's definitely something special about Christmas. And you've got to keep in mind that Christmas is, again, definitely a Catholic thing. I mean, the Orthodox don't really recognize it. They have their Christmas, I think it's on the 6th or the 7th of January, which is what we Catholics call, I think, the Epiphany, if I remember right. Oh, no, maybe that's later. I don't know. Anyway. And so, in essence, Christmas has always been a very Christian tradition. Now, a couple of atheists are going to say, oh, it's the takeover of a pagan religion. And as usual, the atheists are uneducated. They don't know the history and they just make stuff up. So, no, Christmas is not the taking over of a pagan holiday. It's purely a Catholic Christian thing, and has been obviously celebrated for almost 2,000 years now. So it gives a sense of goodwill towards men that is difficult for other people to understand. Now, if you could grasp that feeling, if you've had that feeling, that experience of, say, going to a shop or whatever, or just, in general at work, just before you break up for the holidays, everybody wishing each other Merry Christmas, or doing like a Secret Santa, which, some people do, or whatever. And it creates this generic goodwill where you sort of forgive people their usual idiocies, and you're just like, oh well, it's Christmas, let's just let it go. Now, that sensation is multiplied 100-fold when you've got a group of Catholic people who all attend Mass together, proper Mass, the Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass. And we had that experience because, we had a few disagreements or whatever in our little group. And our priest came by very much as a result of having those conversations, that many of those issues got resolved for many of us from various sides. There is always an intellectual component to it, which is the details of how does canon law work, how is the dogma interpreted by canon law, what does the canon law actually mean, how do you actually apply it. And keep in mind that Catholicism is not a black and white, binary. I mean, it's binary in the sense that what is true and what is false. But the thinking is what I call 3D thinking. You know, if you're 2D thinking, a circle on a piece of paper for you is a wall, is an unbreakable barrier that you can't get past. If you're 3D thinking, it's just a 2D circle, and you can, of course, bypass it, not because you're being dishonest in any way or hypocritical in any way, but because you've got a third dimension that the other people just don't have. So that's pretty much what being a Catholic is compared to Protestants. Protestantism is very limited in its outlook because, of course, it is essentially satanic in its from its inception. So it is a lie. It is a twisting of the truth. But anyway, that sense of community, of forgiveness, of tolerance, of allowing. There's a very good example in our own little church. There's a guy I deeply respect who has a different take on certain things concerning canon law and whatever. And I'd say that the difference is not in our interpretation of canon law, which is, it is what it is. Canon law is canon law. And his difference is, if somebody is not respecting canon law in terms of the even of the worldly aspect rather than the spiritual aspect, I want nothing to do with them, which is, of course, the correct position. My attitude is like, if it's not affecting things at a spiritual level, if it's not affecting the dogma so much, just kind of ignore it and, don't forget it, don't ignore it, don't pretend it's not there, but kind of just roll with the punches. There is a difference in this. It is, my approach to it is because of the times that we're in, and that, we've got a relatively small number of bishops and priests and so on compared to, what we had before 1958. And although, it's arguable how many of those were truly Catholic, but anyway, the point is, maybe not every little rule is being respected, but currently I'm more concerned with effectiveness than with ultimate precision. Of course, in better times, ultimate precision is absolutely the correct thing to do. But again, if you look at my little book, Believe, is that a detailed work of theology? No. It's not even 100 pages. It's 98 or 96 pages, whatever it is. I'm going through it now with adding a few, I wouldn't say corrections, but little add-ons. Like, for example, I hadn't read God's Battalions when I wrote Believe, but I'm going to add that as a reference. Little things like that. And I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think if I just upload version 2.0, the Kindle version will just be automatically updated. Of course, if you had the Dead 3 version, there might be a few little things missing, but on the update. But I don't know what I'm going to be able to do that. I'm only halfway through it, and it's not a very long book at all. But I've got sick kids and all sorts of stuff to do and whatever. But anyway, my point was, even that little offering, that little book, Believe, that I wrote, is affecting a lot of people. I mean, I keep getting, relatively constant email. I know it's converted certain people, and I wanted to mention one guy in particular, Wooly Ram, who sent me an email, a very nice email, by the way, just for Christmas, which I only replied to today. And Wooly Ram said something along the lines of, "Thanks for being my spiritual godfather." Wooly Ram is born, he's Israeli, he lives in Israel, in Jerusalem, I think, and raised Jewish, in a Jewish household and whatever. And because he's read Believe, he's like, that's what tipped me over the edge. I'm going to look for a proper Catholic priest, and as soon as I find one, I'm going to commit. And that's, think of that. Think of somebody who had, really as your foundation, you were raised to believe that Catholics are not just idiots and fools, but almost to be hated. I mean, pretty much, the average Jew considers the average Catholic as an enemy on some level, even if it's not outright, and there are definitely households in which Catholics are seen as absolutely the enemy to destroy. And we can tell this, on a larger scale, by the behavior of certain individuals. But even at an unspoken level, they're definitely not considered your friends. Now, think of somebody who's been independently able to think for themselves enough and read around things enough that a little book like Believe pushes him over the edge to the point where, like, no, this makes sense. This is more true. Now, is Believe like I said, a tome of theology that goes through every little detail? No, not at all. It's kind of a hammer. It's definitely not a scalpel. It's a very precise hammer. It's got some pretty accurate information in it. But, like, for example, one of the criticism, one guy said, oh, well, this guy talks about the Aramaic version of the Bible, and obviously that's nonsense. No, it's not nonsense. You're a fucking moron if you don't understand that the people who, eventually put the Bible together and that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And there are Dead Sea Scrolls that are in Aramaic. There are parts of Mark's Gospel in Aramaic. So why wouldn't you look at that? Of course I would. And, people say, oh, but the Peshitta Bible was not correct. The Peshitta Bible is an Aramaic New Testament. The thing is, I found a version of the New Testament in Aramaic that one of the very smart geniuses of the ilk, and he is genuinely a genius level guy, we're like, that's rubbish. He's obviously just a Jew trying to corrupt the Christianity. And I'm like, no, he's not, And he made all these assumptions about the guy who wrote this Aramaic Bible, and yet couldn't substantiate a single one. And, I do believe the effort was genuine. Now, is an Aramaic Bible, better or worse than a Greek one or an English one? Or, I think you should read a bunch of them. We know, for example, that the King James Bible, which a lot of Protestants, are like deeply attached to, is a mess, because the King James Bible was done as a translation of essentially a Jewish documents that were 600 to 700 years later after the ascension of Jesus, and therefore had been doctored by the Pharisees. Because you have to keep in mind that all the Jews that exist today are essentially Pharisees. They're people who have rejected Jesus, and as such, they definitely amended certain things. King James Bible is a mess as far as Bibles go. So, I suggest, and also the Old Testament, as far as I'm concerned, is 400 years of prophecy and metaphoric storytelling. Is it important? Yeah, sure. But is it 100%? There are a lot of things in the New Testament that refer to the Old Testament. And so it's relevant, but ultimately, the New Testament is the new dispensation, is the new agreement, So really it's the New Testament that you want to look at, and it's also a lot easier to grasp than the Old Testament, which is written in Hebrew originally, and Hebrew is a language that has a way of being written grammatically that can mix metaphor, reality, and history all together, and it's sort of contextual in terms of how you interpret that. So it's quite a difficult thing to grasp. It's not written in King James Bible, just like Jesus spoke. So there's that. But again, coming back to the original point, I know I'm making a bit of a loop, but the thing is, the sensation of Christmas that you get is a tiny aspect, it's a tiny percentage of what you get from a truly Catholic community. And as I was saying, there's a guy in our community that I deeply respect who has an attitude that, like, no, if it's not right, I'm not going to take part in it. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to take part in it because I don't have to obey those things that are not being done correctly. Canonically, I don't, there's no onus on me to do so. But he sees it as, well, but you're being a bit two-faced. And I'm like, I'm Venetian. You broke the rules. I don't have to stick to the rules if you break the rules. I didn't break them first. There's nowhere that it says I got to stick to the rules that you make up. So somebody makes up the rules, I can ignore them. I can still go in the same location and ignore their ideas. And, that's sort of the way I do it. I mean, we came to a point, we were discussing it and proper arguing. And he said, like, no, but don't you understand that's how schism starts? And I said, yeah, I do understand that. But, and I made an example. I said, you do know that in order to take over, what was the Antioch, I think. In order to take over Antioch, Bohemond did so by bribing one of the guards to open one of the gates, and he laughed because he understood exactly where I was coming from, which is sometimes you gotta, bend the rule a little bit to get where you need to get. If there hadn't been people like Bohemond, we wouldn't have Christianity. At the same time, if we didn't have people like the gentleman I'm talking about, we also wouldn't have Christianity. You need both. You need the guy that's willing to go a little bit outside the lines, because that's what a special op team does. That's what the Crusaders did, and you also need the rigid guy that holds the home front steady. So you need both. And on that note, we will be bringing out, thanks to some of the immortals, which are volunteering some of their time, and thanks to my priest and a bunch of other people. But it is my hope that in the new year we will be bringing out a couple of very Catholic things. I'm not going to say what they are, not to spoil the surprise. They're going to be very sort of, for Catholic people, pretty much only one of them is going to be something that's only in Latin. So, that gives you an idea. The other one that I'm trying to do is something quite a bit more involved that will require permissions and so on. But I think a much needed thing. It's going to be essentially an exposition of the sede-provationist belief system from a very theologically accurate point of view. So in other words, it's going to be a theologically sound work that goes through all the details. And it is essentially the root of the sede-provationist situation or theory, whatever you want to call it. And in researching this thing, I also came across a guy's book called Sede Vacante by a guy called Griff Ruby. It's actually 2 volumes, not light reading, quite hectic stuff, very detailed. I'm sort of almost finished with the first one, and I've skimmed sort of the second one. I see where he's coming from, but pardon me, but it's a little bit too involved, in my opinion, and it's a little bit too detailed. It's almost like slightly autistic concepts going through right to the end of the X, to sort of try and say, where did the Vatican II stuff really go astray, and where did it specifically happen, in which document, which word in which document. And I don't think that is ultimately all that important, although precision is important. I mean, for example, one of the by the way, if somebody out there knows how to get a transcript of the debate I had with Jay Dyer, just send it to me. I have asked Vox, but he's really busy at the moment, and I don't think he's reading his emails. So if you do have a transcript, because I want to go through it, just to see, if there is anything I messed up on or whatever, to which I would own up. But there's other things. One of his supporters sent a list, and I don't know that it's accurate, and I don't really have the time to go list, backwards and forwards through the video. That's why the transcript would be more useful. And he mentions a bunch of canons of why I was wrong, because he mentioned the canon law, blah blah blah. But the problem is that all these canons come after canon 160, so it's something like, it's canon 161, 154, blah blah blah, and it mentions a bunch of canons that relate to the debate I had with Jay Dyer about the election of the Pope. However, unfortunately for them, canon 160 invalidates all that stuff pretty much, because it says the election of the Roman Pontiff is guided solely by the Constitution of Pope Pius X, Vacante Sede Apostolica of 25th December 1904. Which is very interesting, because it's one of the only constitutions that is not at the Vatican site. Isn't that interesting? In other ecclesiastical elections, the prescriptions of the canons that follow are to be observed, as well as those special ones, if there are any, that are established for individual offices. So all the canons that follow that relate to, clerical offices of various bishops and blah blah blah. But isn't it interesting how good old Mr. Dyer, once again, just takes things out of context and just says, oh, it's canon this and that and the other. And yeah, off the top of my head, I've read the book of canon law, but it doesn't mean that I memorized each numbers or whatever. But it's interesting that as soon as I thought, well, let me just go have a quick look, see what these canons, whether he had any point, well, pretty much every one of them just gets blown out of the water, because you have to refer to that constitution, which I have. Unfortunately, there's only one translation in English, which is not great, and the original in Latin, which is again pretty thick reading, even if you are fluent in Latin. And I wouldn't say I'm fluent. I understand it, I can read Latin, but it's not, papal constitutions and papal encyclicals are pretty accurate, very accurate documents written with a very clear language. So I would hesitate to read only the Latin original and sort of say that I've got the whole thing. And the English translation is, a little bit iffy, and even I can tell that. So I'll have to take a bit more time on that. But I will eventually go through every single one of Dyer's points, and I will put it on the blog, just to prove a point. So yeah, that's basically it for today. I hope you had a good Christmas. I hope that the new year is a good one for you, and that you find your way back to true Christianity, which is Catholicism. That's right. If any of you are getting upset, well, what can I tell you? Sometimes, like my grandmother said, the truth hurts. Anyway, seriously, I do hope you had a good Christmas, and I hope you have a great 2020, and that you convert and join us. Become Catholic if you're not already. Have a good night.